This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacy.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. We've entered an era of accelerated digitalization in life sciences. Innovation has been thrust upon many across industry as a need to work remotely. Automating tasks and virtual collaborations were necessary during the pandemic. Maintaining this accelerated pace, fully embracing the adoption of technology and automation is the next hurdle we face. Will CSA get us there? Here to demystify the CSA shift is Ron Schardong, Senior Director of Quality at Johnson & Johnson. So welcome, Ron. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. So before we start, I just need to give a quick disclaimer so I will make my legal partners happy. So just to let you know that this presentation is only intended for educational purposes, and it does not represent or any independent professional judgment. So again, I suggest, again, if you have any legal questions about the content, to again solicit input from legal department, and unless expressly stated to the contrary, any opinions again are my opinions. This is not necessarily the position of Johnson & Johnson or its affiliates. So With that, back to you.
Thanks, Ron. I appreciate that. Yes, of course. Your experiences are valuable to us. You'll be speaking from your experiences only, so we don't want to get anybody in trouble. But I do appreciate you coming to share what knowledge you have on this topic. I know you've been part of the committee working with FDA on the computer software assurance updates. So it's really great to get you here. And speaking of that document, as we await the unofficial FDA draft document, many have speculated that traditional CSV, or computer system validation, will be completely replaced by CSA, or computer software assurance guidances. Others rightly understand that a change in priorities may be at the heart of the shift, not a complete overhaul. So can you kick us off by providing a little bit of historical perspective on the CSA effort, and tell us a little bit more about what it actually is?
Sure. So computer software assurance, or CSA, started as a joint effort between the FDA, primarily the Centers for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH, and also representatives from the medical device and pharmaceutical industry. And industry, as well as the FDA, felt that one of the greatest impediments to utilizing automation and technology is caused by some of the existing practices in CSV, or computer system validation. The perceived burden of the documentation required for, and I'm using in the air quotes like validation, usually acts a deterrent to innovation using technology solutions and automation. So to stimulate the adoption of technology and automation, the FDA and industry representatives sought to identify practices and principles to assure a safe, repeatable, and reproducible, as well as a compliant technology solution that is released for use. So CSV is being rebranded as CSA to signify this paradigm shift. But this rebranding does not mean that CSV is being eliminated and replaced by CSA. So instead is that CSA and the associated principles, essentially, they're intended to bring back the focus on quality and reliability of GXP systems, and then meeting the intended use, but also reducing the risk to patients and users through more testing that is intended to identify and correct defects, while applying the least burdensome approach to documentation practices.
Great, thank you for that explanation. So it sounds like CSV is just being rebranded. So most of the major components will still be there in some fashion, but under CSA, or the brand of CSA, they're just really helping to reframe or refocus industry on the important pieces of the document, the important pieces of quality, which is the assurance that patient safety is first and foremost in our minds, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So is CSA only about the FDA and medical devices, or does it apply to other regulators, health authorities, and businesses within health science industry?
So CSA goes beyond the FDA and medical devices, even though that's where it started. And it is applicable to other regulators and health authorities and businesses within the health science industry. CSA by itself is not a regulation or international standard. So existing regulations and international standards outlining what regulators and health authorities require for validation of computerized systems, they are still in effect. So that, again, CSA is not changing that. So CSA seeks to clarify the industry's current interpretation of existing regulations and how industry intends to comply with those regulations. The practices and principles in CSA are consistent with GAMP5. So for those, again, that have been in this industry for a while are familiar with GAMP5, which is recognized as a consensus document across the health sciences industry and recognized by health authorities, again, across devices, pharmaceutical, biologicals, consumer products, and also like recognized by standard setting organizations as a gold standard when it comes to GXP computer systems. So ISPE GAMP5, which is, again, is called a risk-based approach to compliant GXP computerized system, is recognized as that gold standard. And when it comes to the validation of GXP computer system, it is broadly accepted and adopted globally and across various branches of the health science industry, such as, again, as I mentioned, like pharmaceuticals, devices, biologicals, in vitro diagnostic, cosmetics, and so forth. So GAMP5, if you're familiar with it, it's not a prescriptive method, and it provides a pragmatic guidance and approaches and tools for GXP computer system validation, which focuses on patient safety, product quality, and data integrity. And more specifically, again, some of the items from GAMP5 that you will see mentioned many times around CSA is like one of them is to avoid duplication of activities. For example, by fully integrating engineering and computer system activities so that they're only performed once. Leveraging supplier activities to the maximum possible extent while still ensuring the fitness for the intended use. And also it talks about scale all life cycle activities and associated documentation according to risk, complexity, and novelty. And I think CSA is big on, again, using less paper or no paper and using technology for that, but also even in those cases, like how much of it is used. So again, back to the least burdensome approach. And then also GAMP says it, like, again, to recognize that most computer systems are now based on configurable packages, and many of them are networked. And also, last but not least, again, from GAMP, and which is reflected in CSA, is to acknowledge that traditional linear or waterfall development models are not necessarily the most appropriate in all cases. So one size does not fit all. Waterfall, I think it was in fashion a while back. We now have agile methodology. There is a place for each one of those. So again, it's not like a one size fits all.
Excellent. So, I mean, this document is there for guidance purposes only, but isn't replacing any of the other guidance or documents, best practice documents that we are used to seeing, GAMP5 from ISPE, some of the ISO standards in some cases, it includes all of the GXP standards that people are using. So, just need to remember that, you have to take a little bit from each of them as it applies to your organization and to your intended use, it sounds like. And I heard you, Ron, say several times that part of CSA is to reduce the burden. The intention of CSA is to reduce the burden. And I have a follow-up question based on that. So if one of the greatest impediments to utilizing automation and technology is this perceived burden of documentation under CSV, how can we shift those practices under CSA to help eliminate some of that burden?
Yeah, so it seems like validation of computerized system has become synonymous to documentation. It's almost like the joke is GMP stands for give me more paper. So like regardless of how reliable the software application is, it's just like there is just like a ton of documentation. So over time, I think industry has applied the rigor of validating a medical device, for example, which is like an actual, or medical device software, which is an actual product. And like, for example, like software as a medical device or software in a medical device, which has a direct impact on the device or product safety and quality. And it seems like industry has applied that rigor to business process applications as defined by GAMP. So again, these are things that they're not a product. It's just like it's software that is used to drive a business process. So CSA is focused on challenging some of the existing paradigm for validation of GXP computerized systems, particularly software testing and documentation. So I think once CSA guidance from the FDA finally comes out, you'll see that there's going to be a big emphasis on software testing and documentation, because that is the biggest burden that we have. So this paradigm shift is intended to challenge some of the current industry practices by focusing on principles already covered by GAMP 5. So for example, critical thinking. Again, GAMP 5 is all about critical thinking and focusing on patient safety, product quality, and data integrity. Also, the least burdensome approach to validation and documentation, to use science-based quality risk management, or again, how we manage risks. And also a scalable approach to GXP compliance and documentation. So again, based on complexity, based on risk, you then determine, okay, like how much documentation is needed to do it. And again, primarily focusing what is the quality of that end product. Also effective supplier relationships and leveraging work that is already done by the software supplier. So again, these days, suppliers are, I would say, more open to the idea of sharing, or at least helping their clients with some of these things, because it also means at the end of the day, less work for them. And also the use of existing documentation and knowledge, which is also, again, talked about many times through GAMP 5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just listening to you talk about all of these things, like in the terms that are coming out, critical thinking and data integrity and least burdensome, these are all terms that everyone's familiar with. So it doesn't sound like there's a lot of new terms or even new ideas coming out with this document, but rather just a revised thought, or revised view of some of the practices that we've been using for years. So one of the things I noted is when we talk about industry sort of embracing anything new, it does take us a long time to get there, to make changes in the pharmaceutical and medical device industries. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. I'm just want to talk a little bit about this idea about the regulatory burden and data, whether it's data integrity or documentation as an excuse for resisting progress, right? We hear a lot of people say, oh, well, I have legacy systems, or this is the way we've always done it, and I don't have time or resources to make changes, or whatever the excuse is. It seems to be the default fallback. So meanwhile, other regulated and non-regulated industries have moved forward and adopted modern testing frameworks. And I know you talked a little bit about testing already, but the CSA framework, or does it reframe the way that will allow for greater advances here, both in quality of systems and modern testing practices?
Yeah, I think it does, and I agree with you that sometimes, again, they're like one of the interesting intricacies of human beings, that we're very good in making excuses sometimes for not getting certain things done.
Easier.
And so again, I think CSA is going to help in reframing some of that, and really taking a look and a focus on quality. And I think one of the important aspects of that is really, again, it's the process starts by considering like what is the risk of the intended use of that software. And I think GAMP, again, already like talks about that quite a bit, about, again, understanding the intended use, and then things are driven from there. So again, by starting by, again, establishing the intended use, and then evaluating like features and operation and functionality of that software, and how that, particularly like how it directly impacts patient safety, product quality, and data integrity. And then again, and then we like, and so that kind of like it's going to drive the process. So again, looking particularly again how it will directly impact, like, for example, like physical properties of a product or manufacturing process, and how we identify that, again, how that is essential to product quality. Also, again, based on intended use is like how it, like maybe the intended use is automating a process or a parameter, or again, how it's collecting feedback or information about disposition of non-conforming products, or things that measure and inspect and determine acceptability of a product or a process, or things that have a direct, again, impact on safety and purity and integrity and function and efficacy of a product. So those are all things, again, based on risk and risk assessment and intended use of the device, that I think is going to help to kind of like keep the focus on what is really significant and relevant for that application, and then then driving the process. So those systems and software features that are clearly identified as having a direct patient impact risk may need more rigor or more rigorous assurance effort, and maybe, again, more rigorous documentation. But on the opposite side of that is, again, you have situations like for indirect patient risk safety, and the assurance effort, again, can be maybe, again, least burdensome as possible. So some examples of indirect impact, again, these are just examples. So like, I'm like, don't quote me on this one. It says like, Ron said this. Again, this is just, again, some examples, but it will be situations where the software feature operation function, for example, like collecting and recording data from a process monitoring review or statistical process control. Or another example would be quality system, like, again, around quality system integrity, things related to data integrity, compliance with regulations. Again, they don't have a direct impact on patient safety, right? So it's one of those things, again, for each company will have to like come up with a set of rules, again, and to help out on that. I'm sure like for every item, there is usually like 3 sides of the story, like yours, mine, and the truth, right. Where some of these things, again, people might disagree, but as long as, again, we have that like written down, again, as part of our strategy, then I would say we all stand a good chances of being able to defend it. So as part of the risk considerations, again, at least for us, again, we plan to further leverage like software vendor qualification results, particularly, again, including confidence in their software development lifecycle. So to do that, a company might have to change the way that they do software assessments, because, again, if the intent is to leverage work that is done by the vendor, depending what it is, it's not just like, okay, let me see some of your validation documentation. It might be, well, how is it that you do, essentially, what is your process, and can I trust your process, versus, again, having a heavy reliance on documentation alone. So that, again, is something that our understanding is that the scope of 21 CFR 82070I, which is the particular section of 820 that talks about computer systems, again, is a one line, and in industry has done like a lot to try to explain and to work with that. But again, it is intended for computer systems that are used again as part of a production or the quality system, not something that is intended to be about this, again, like something that is like software as a medical device or software in a medical device, which might require more rigor. So again, it's trying to bring industry to the point of treating a business process application as a business process application, not as a product. So again, so that again for us, again, we might also try to use automation to capture some of the functional requirements and evidence that on case and all that. So again, moving away from paper and using more of the digital tools that are available today, particularly again, if a company is using agile development methodology, there are many tools that again fit very nicely with that approach. And so again, why not use that for the purposes of regulatory compliance?
Absolutely. And we are moving, as we mentioned at the top of this episode, towards a more digitalized industry altogether. But it's baby steps always. But what I'm hearing a lot, hearing you say a lot, is less documentation, more critical thinking and testing. So under CSA, does reducing risk to patients, for example, identifying and remediating defects, equate to more testing? Or are we really talking about better testing practices here? Because we don't want to get rid of the documentation just to add some more of something else, right? I mean, it's really about streamlining and simplifying what we're doing.
Yeah, it's not a case of like exchanging 6 for half a dozen, right?
Exactly.
It would be like one in the same. So definitely, again, I think to your question is like we're doing more testing or better testing. And I'll say there are like multiple ways of testing software. And I think as industry, we kind of like have leaned towards doing robust scripting like all the time, like with like everything detail by detail, keystroke by keystroke, screenshot by screenshot, and also having like screenshots of everything as evidence that something has occurred. And I think again, robust scripted testing is not the only option. So each type of testing has a place in time, and the project team that is working on it should consider when a particular type is to be used based on critical thinking and the risk. So for example, like scripted versus unscripted, or limited scripted versus robust scripted. Those are all options. And I think we as industry should consider those, and they all have a place and time. It is important also to understand that unscripted testing, again, for me at least, like English not being my native language, sometimes it has a connotation of, because it is unscripted, it is undocumented testing. And the reality is like, that's not what it means. So there is a minimum set of expectations of documentation for unscripted testing. So unscripted testing still means that, again, there's not going to be a step-by-step, click-by-click, or keystroke, but there is at least like a minimum set of instructions for that test. So unscripted testing in any of its forms still require that you have some test objectives, like what you're trying to accomplish, and at the end is like, what were your results? And also, particularly if in doing so you encounter some defects, being able to document that defect so that can be evaluated for impact and fixed if it makes sense, or that goes into your backlog. So it is more testing, but also different testing. It's not more testing of the same kind that we do today. Sure.
And we are going to talk a little bit more about the various kinds of testing a little bit later in this discussion. But I wanted you talked a lot about GAMP5 and all of the guidance or best practices that GAMP5 offers us. And so I just had a question, because that is such a strong document, and GAMP5 is considered to be the gold standard here in industry. Why then do we need CSA?
I think that's a great question. I think CSA does not take away from GAMP5 and also does not add to GAMP5, but instead it brings together some principle and practices that are many times like sprinkled or scattered like throughout GAMP5. And then it provides some specific details where industry practices have maybe like departed from the intent of GAMP5. And also there was a document from the FDA like 20-something years ago, which was called General Principles of Software Validation. So, yes, there is a gold standard, but again, if you have read GAMP 5, it is like a yay thick book if you have it like printed.
Perfect.
So
Reading.
it is, again, it's quite a bit of reading, and it is there, like it's sprinkled in there. So CSA is just basically taking some of those like nuggets of wisdoms or these little pearls and basically like putting in like into a package that, okay, like here are some things that, again, like industry already has done for a long period of time. Let's go back to, again, focusing on doing quality and delivering a quality product. And again, if you're focusing on quality by default, you're also going to deliver something that is compliant. But
Absolutely.
just filling ourselves with piles and piles of paper, it's not going to, it doesn't necessarily translate into a good quality product.
Precisely. I mean, we've been doing that for decades, and we're still, you know, nobody's scoring 100 on the regulator check-ins, right? Like there's still compliance issues out there. So if it was just a matter of documentation and screenshotting, then we would have mastered that by now, I guess. But Ron, so far you've done a great job in this discussion about really highlighting the goals of CSA. What is CSA not intended to provide?
I think that is also, it's important to know is like what is, but also what is not. And sometimes if you know the not, then by default, at least like how my brain works is, well, if there is not a not associated with it, then it means a yes. So CSA is not intended to provide a complete description of all software verification and validation principles, right? So like I think as industry, we need to set our expectations. It is not also, CSA is not a software development lifecycle or an SDLC framework, right? GAMP has all those components to it. CSA is not. So again, don't expect it to basically redo like the whole SDLC because of CSA. It does not address like the end-to-end software operation processes like as described in GAMP 5, such as like support services they need for your software and performance monitoring, incident management, security management, backup and restore, and the list goes on. Again, CSA is like, it's narrow focused. It's not as comprehensive as GAMP 5, and definitely, again, is not a full SDLC. Also, CSA does not provide recommendations for the validation of software in medical device or SIMD, or software as a medical device, SAMD. So those are part of 21 CFR 82030G, which is design controls. And there is, again, plenty of guidance around that, like already, like for industry. So kind of like it's not going to get into those details. And then CSA is intended to provide clarification on, again, just on the interpretation of 82070I, which is the one statement in the QSR that talks about computer systems that are used in production and for quality. So again, these are business process applications, or sometimes, again, it could be automation in manufacturing processes. And also, additionally, CSA does not address things like Part 11. Or Annex 11 for Europe, or anything related to Part 11 and Annex 11. So again, there is plenty of guidance for those things out there. So CSA just, again, it doesn't get into those, because otherwise it will be again a pretty long document. So there is already guidance on those that we didn't feel that there was a need for adding any more to what is already out there.
Some excellent points of clarification. So thank you for that. As long as we understand what we're working with here, it does make it easier for everyone. So an organization's ability, then, you've mentioned intended use a few times, and an organization's ability to focus on intended use is a major component of this paradigm shift. And for our listeners, can you tell us why that's important?
Sure, and I think, again, that is, I would say, is like if there is one thing that you walk away from this whole thing is, again, is understanding intended use. And when I first came to work in the space of CSV, like it became pretty clear, like right away, that once you understood intended use, and everything cascaded from there. And so essentially, that's how you then determine, again, your risk and how you scale things, and how deep and wide you go. So by establishing the intended use of the system or software or feature, will then help us to determine what is the impact that this has on product safety or quality or data integrity. So when system software features are clearly identified as resulting in a direct impact to safety, they might need more rigor, more rigorous assurance, and also maybe like more rigor in some of their records, like for example, maybe using scripted test protocols, detailing some of the test scenarios, test methods, and expected outcomes, again, because of the risk and sometimes complexity. But for indirect patient safety risk, then the assurance effort and the recorded results should be the least burdensome as possible. So for example, like limited scripted testing, business simulations, ad hoc testing, and so on. So the intended use is key for that, because in some cases, also by understanding the intended use of your application, you might come to the realization that it is not GXP, since you don't need that to comply with regulatory requirements. And you still will apply good business, again, good software development practices and managing your business risk with that application, but it may not be GXP at all. So understanding the intended use is key for like a variety of things.
Absolutely. And then understanding the risk associated, and not that all risk is not necessarily prioritized or should not necessarily be prioritized the same, right? And you have to, within your own company, figure out, high, medium, and low, like where risks lie and how comfortable you are as an organization, or based on your intended use, where you need to have more rigor, to your point from earlier, or less. So under this risk-based testing approach, and we're going to talk a little bit more about testing that you mentioned just a short time ago, and thinking about prioritizing risk and understanding intended use. With risk-based testing approaches, the focus becomes unscripted or ad hoc testing for medium and low risk components, leveraging prior assurance activities basically for that, right? And how can we use this to build higher confidence then in system performance and therefore in our product quality?
Yeah, I might maybe like I'm departing a little bit from the pack. Is like I know people like tend to gravitate towards like an FMEA or a failure mode and effect analysis. I think again, when it comes to some of these things, like we have to ditch the tool and some of the rigid approach in determining again what is needed based on risk. And sometimes like all options might be viable options. And so I think so like we have to keep everything on the table as an option, and then as we understand what are the implications and when is something is more suitable to then bring that to the table. So even again with automation, it is impossible to test every possible like what if situation with software. So if we try to test and document every what if situations, we might be testing something and documenting for a very long period of time. Think of like, for example, AI or machine learning. Again, you could be like testing all what if scenarios with some of your modeling from here until again the cows come home, the proverbial saying. So by doing that, again, we might not embrace new technology because of the fear of validation and documentation. So it's one of those things like we need to treat business process applications for what they are. And as a business process application, risk-based approach, and it is something that is not life-saving or life-sustaining products. So with again, back to the risk question is, there is a place and a time for again the various types of testing and documentation, but I think we also need to keep in mind that most of the time what we're dealing with, these are business process applications, and we should again treat them as such and understand that in most cases there is no direct impact to patient safety or product quality. So as industry, we do a lot of testing, but we don't necessarily take credit for that work. We also limit ourselves to robust scripted testing, right? The one that details everything. But you need to think about it, it's like nobody in real life, when they're using a business process application, they don't follow a script. Right? In real life, people say, oh, I wonder what happens if I click over here, if I try to delete this file, or if I try a shortcut. So scripts are very good to get like to a specific outcome, but that is not what real life is. And what we have found in some of the experiments that we have done is that we actually find more issues by using limited scripted testing, because since it is not so prescriptive, it actually you end up finding some of the glitches. And so that is, again, you will say like, oh, you're finding more defects. It's like, well, the reality is it's better that we find it now and fix it now than if we release it and then our customer tells us that there is something wrong, because at that point, then the implications are greater. So limited scripted testing and unscripted testing actually, again, will help us to find more issues and fix them before that application is placed in production. So if you think of it, it is really like common sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks, Ron. So to reiterate what you said earlier, CSA is not new guidance. It's a new way of looking at the processes involved in assuring quality. And you've given us a lot of examples of that today. So, and actually there are a large number of early adopters across industry who have been using testing, or who have been testing, I should say, CSA principles for 5 years or more, with tremendous support and value realization. So again, not new, and it's being tested. So hopefully that brings some solace to some people in industry. So Ron, with that, what are the next steps for industry as a whole?
So I think as industry, we should start taking steps to implement CSA principles that are currently sprinkled across GAM5. Taking the least burdensome approach and applying critical thinking. Some people might be more comfortable than others making some of these changes. I think people can start small with like simple things such as moving away from paper and using digital solutions to capture some of their requirements in testing and test results. Also, I think people need to start doing some of the test and learn or pilots. Again, those are good ways to try something new, to try it out, maybe like, again, in a smaller scale. And then as that, again, we become more comfortable than going into like a big and bold and then making larger changes. So if you're not comfortable going into the deep end of the pool, try the shallow end first. Again, try with small things, gain confidence, and kind of like refine as you go. So I guess the whole like test and learn, and just like keep evolving, keep doing.
Excellent. Thank you, Ron. And before we wrap up today, I mean, you've given such great insights into this whole CSV versus CSA and what it actually is. And I really appreciate it. I know for the benefit of our listeners, as well as for myself. Are there any additional thoughts or ideas that you'd like to leave with our audience today?
Sure. I would say, again, as parting words to this audience, I would like to say that what CSA is proposing is not new. I think, again, if you have been in this industry, in this space for a while, you're going to see that it's just like, these are all things that have been out there. So there is an enormous amount of comfort in the known, and discomfort in the unknown are different. So what CSA is doing is just to make us think about what we do and why we do it, and to ask ourselves, does it still make sense to do things in the way we do? Or is there a better way to do this? And also to use technology that is available to us, and also best practices in software development. So once we ask ourselves those questions, then we have a choice to make. We can continue to do the same or change. So the choice is really yours. As for me, again, I have chosen to change. So I like to ask the question all the time, like, does it still make sense to do it this way? Or why is it we do it this way? Is there like a better way to do it? And then taking some steps to change that. So I'm not trying to change the world all at once. I'm trying to change the things that are more like in my immediate surrounding. Those are the ones that I have control of.
Perfect. Yeah. And again, you said common sense earlier. To me, that's just common sense, right? constantly reevaluating and making sure, like, does this still make sense? Or am I just doing this simply because I've always done it? And I think if the more people can ask themselves that question, the easier it is to start to to embrace change and to step outside of the box a little bit. So I thank you for leaving us with those thoughts. And Ron, it's been so great to have you as our guest today. And I really want to just thank you again for all of the insights into this topic and really helping us to dispel some of the misconceptions about CSA. Hopefully this helps.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yep, go ahead, Ron.
So just like, thank you for having me.
Oh yeah, no, it was great. I definitely was looking forward to this discussion, and you did not disappoint, so much appreciated. I also want to give a shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and most importantly, I'm sending my thanks to you, our valued listeners. I appreciate your time each week, as well as your help in sharing this podcast. Together, we can continue to spread the word. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and be sure to share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks so they can enjoy it too. Plus, don't forget to leave us a quick note or an online review. We really do appreciate your time on that. For show notes and additional podcast resources, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. And we'll be back again next week with another informative and timely discussion. Until then, make it a great week.